John Dennehy, founder of My First Bitcoin, here in the studio with us today. What's up, man? Thanks for coming by.
Hey, good seeing you. Thanks for having me.
So the question on everyone's mind is, why do you think the U.S. should not have a strategic Bitcoin reserve, John? What?
Yeah, let's start off with something that bring everybody together that we could all agree on, right? Yeah, I got into Bitcoin a little bit more than 10 years ago as a way to seek an alternative to the status quo, right? And that status quo is probably best represented by the U.S. empire, whether that's the dollar system, but just in a general sense, the U.S. empire.
The wars, and it manifests in different ways in different realms of society, right?
Yeah.
But the money is a big one.
And this morning, Senator Loomis, she had this announcement. The language, look at the language of her announcement, which everybody was cheerleading, right? Everybody was like, reshare and like, oh, this is great for Bitcoin. She literally cites that a strategic Bitcoin reserve will strengthen the US dollar. This is a paragraph statement that she released, right? This isn't some buried thing in the appendix. They're saying the quiet part out loud now that this is about extending the US empire, right? This is a way that they see to extend the US empire, and that's not something that I support.
That's not what I signed up for.
Yeah, that's not what I signed up for. Right? That's not what Bitcoin's supposed to be. And I think it's a time preference thing, because and it's a price thing too, right? There's number go up and freedom go up, and often it's the same thing. Often when the price goes up, it's good for freedom. This would be great for price if the US government started buying Bitcoin. I don't know if there's anything that would be more bullish for the price of Bitcoin.
I don't think so.
It would be incredibly bullish for the price of Bitcoin. But at what cost, right? I think the greatest potential of Bitcoin is to create a different future, to create an alternative future, one in which we don't have centralized institutions that dictate our lives to us. And the US empire isn't part of that, right? Isn't part of this future that I want to see. So I don't want to strengthen it. And I think, the price of Bitcoin is going to go up, whether the US government is buying it or not. It just changes the amount of time that it takes, right? Like, it would get to $1 million pretty fast if the US government started buying Bitcoin. It'd get there much slower if they didn't.
But it'll get there.
But it will get there. And as Bitcoiners, we shouldn't have this mentality of this very instant gratification sort of mentality, like
high time preference.
Yeah, high time preference. Don't think what's best for the price of Bitcoin next month. Think what's best for my children, what's best for my grandchildren. And it's not this. It's not the US government doubling down on their dominance on the world, right? And I don't mean to be too anti-US. It's not about just the US government. It's about large centralized institutions that control and dominate the current world. I don't want them to control and dominate the next world. I don't want them to just paint themselves orange and say they're, now things are different. We're Bitcoiners now. Things aren't different. If large centralized institutions dictate our future, then we've missed a massive opportunity to reimagine what's possible with this Bitcoin revolution.
Okay, so that was a great introduction. And the reason I wanted to ask you that in the beginning is because I think it is a great portfolio, if you will, of why My First Bitcoin is doing such epic work, because I think those are first principles. These are fundamentals that your organization stands by in your mission. So there's a lot of places we can take this conversation, but first, let's talk about My First Bitcoin,
Yeah.
what you've been doing here in El Salvador, how long ago it started, how it's going, and if anyone hasn't heard of you guys, let them know what's up.
Yeah, cool. So My First Bitcoin, or Mi Primer Bitcoin, is a Bitcoin education nonprofit. We started here in El Salvador in August of 2021, so it's been about 3.5 years at this point. And on the surface, we're just a Bitcoin education nonprofit, right? We're just orange pilling people, specifically people who are new to the space. So we focus on introductory Bitcoin education rather than like super technical, very advanced stuff. Like we're trying to help people take their first step. And since we've begun here in El Salvador, we've taught about 40,000 students in person. And everything that we do is open source. So because of that, it's led to some really great. It's led to a lot of indirect impact. So we have helped to train 500 public school teachers to teach our flagship product, which is the Bitcoin diploma, in the public school system here. So they're off. That's not counted in our numbers, right? They're off teaching. I don't know how many students they've taught at this point. This is an ongoing. We started training public school teachers at the end of 2023. So I don't know how many they've taught, but we're working with the Ministry of Education, and the goal is to bring this to every school in the country. We also have created what we call a node network of independent Bitcoin educators. And in order to join the network, you have to have some proof of work. Like by and large, it's people who are already teaching the Bitcoin diploma or other materials that we've created for introductory Bitcoin education. And you have to agree to some core values. And those core values are that the education must be independent, impartial, community-led, quality, Bitcoin only, and teach empowerment. So if you agree to those principles, you could demonstrate proof of work, then you could apply to join the network. And at this point, because one of our core values is empowerment, right? We're not trying to dictate to people. So it's actually self-governing at this point. We don't control the network.
The node network.
Yeah, the node network. So the network itself would decide whether new people are admitted or not. And at this point, the network has, we have projects in more than 35 countries around the world, and many countries have multiple projects. So there's probably about 50 or 60 different projects around the world that are part of this network.
Yeah. I don't know if it's possible to pull up a screenshot of the GitHub, the node network GitHub. Is it part of the My First Bitcoin GitHub, or is it a different GitHub? It's obviously a different repo, but anyway, in there, It's really cool. We could, there it is. Perfect. You can go through, is it OS Everything, where all the different countries are?
No, OS Everything is open source everything. So that's a different initiative that we have. Basically, we want to open source everything.
How do we find the list of nodes? Because I was looking through this the other day for a thread, or a few months ago, and it was awesome because I saw an old friend that does have a Bitcoin, the directory right there.
Yeah.
I think in Oregon or something. And I was just clicking around randomly, and I was like, hey, I know that guy. That's my buddy. And I sent him a message. Go ahead, I just saw you in the node network. That's awesome. But this is really cool. And you can see some of these are kind of stagnant, I noticed, but a lot of them are not.
Yeah.
And you can see all over the world what these different organizations are doing. And I just thought, I wasn't as big of a Bitcoiner as I am now, back when I was a nomad and I was doing my thing around the world before I had kids. But how cool would this have been? Because it gives you a list of destinations to go be a part of something.
Well, it's, I think something that's really cool about it is it makes it
That's a cool map.
feel like you're part of something bigger. Yeah. So every orange Bitcoin is a project in the network. So and the network is only 1.5 years old. So it's grown pretty quickly. We add 3 or 4 new countries a month.
This is incredible. So real quick, before we move forward, let's just talk about this from an entrepreneurial perspective. Did you have experience building a big I mean, I guess you're not a huge organization, but you're getting a lot done. I know you have a team that you're pretty much in charge of, or at least organizing, focalizing. Had you done this before you started My First Bitcoin?
No. I mean, so I see My First Bitcoin less as an education project and more as an activist project. And I do have some experience with activism, but not at this scale, not on like a global scale. I'm talking like, university clubs sort of thing rather than this.
Yeah. And so you've built this from the ground up, I imagine, learning a lot.
Yes.
About
steep learning
leadership and yeah. So what's that been like real quick?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that, but I just want to say quickly that the project, on that activism theme, it's a Trojan horse. Right? It's not actually about Bitcoin education. This is a Bitcoin education project, which is not actually about Bitcoin education. It's about empowerment. It's about sovereignty. It's about having agency in your own life.
And that is in the workbook you guys have, that's common, a common review. Because I think you said it first, but other people have mentioned like learning about Bitcoin or how to use a wallet is like the end of the curriculum, because you learn about everything else first, which really focuses on the empowerment of the individual.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, I think the path to a better world is an individual who's able to have agency in their own life, because that has some really significant second and third order effects, right? Like if the world that we currently inhabit, somebody else tells us what to do basically all the time, right? We don't have a lot of say in our own lives. There's some small committee of people you've never met that is dictating your life to you, basically. And that is very disempowering. It is hard to start a business if you don't know what the interest rates will be, if you don't know how the policies will shift, because somebody is making those policies and it's not you, and they don't know you, and they don't care about you.
It can rug pull you at any time.
So it's hard. It's hard to plan. And when it's hard to plan, it's hard to look into the future. And when it's hard to look into the future, then it makes you have this like instant gratification, the short time preference. And it actually has this negative feedback loop, right? Where you become more dependent on somebody telling you what to do, somebody taking responsibility for you. And Bitcoin flips that, right? Once you realize that you can control your money, you realize that you could have more control over your power, you could have more say in your own future. And once you make that mental shift, you're more likely to start a business, because with Bitcoin, on a Bitcoin standard, you could predict the future better. Right? I know there's like a lot of critique about Bitcoin that it's volatile. The price discovery is volatile, but the system is very predictable, right? Like I know how many Bitcoins will be in circulation in 5 days, in 5 years. You don't with dollars. Like nobody knows, right? So it's easier to plan with Bitcoin, but more than being easier to plan, nobody could take it from you. There's permissionless innovation. Like it changes the way that you view yourself in your own future and your own role in that story. Like all of a sudden you could be the protagonist of your own story, which is not the case today, which is not the case for most people in the fiat world. So it also, it makes it easier to start a business. It makes it easier to start a family. Basically, it makes you look further into the future and be more involved in your own destiny, in your own future.
So the Bitcoin thing is a Trojan horse for self-empowerment.
Yeah.
Okay. That's beautiful. Yeah. So you've been building this organization and you're a nonprofit. I don't know if we mentioned that yet. You're a nonprofit that does not take funding from the government.
Yes. We work with the Ministry of Education. We do not work for the Ministry of Education.
Would you say that is a distinction that sometimes gets muddied up in the nonprofit NGO world?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, this is something that we have to push back against, and it's delicate, right? Because we're grateful to have a good relationship with the government here. So we don't want to push back too hard and be like, oh, the government's like, bad and we don't like them. And that's not true. But we want people to know that we're not funded by the government. And there's two reasons for that. One is independence is so important to us. And that if we were funded by the government, and the reason why we don't take government funding from this government or any other, and we never will, is because that will inevitably compromise our independence.
So it compromises those values you mentioned earlier, like the impartiality, right?
Yeah. Maybe not on day one, but on a long enough timeline, it will. And we're trying to think far into the future. But the other reason is we are primarily grassroots funded. So we're primarily funded by individual Bitcoiners who think that it's a worthy cause to support and they donate some sats. If people think that we are funded by the government, they're probably not going to donate. At the very least, they're less likely to donate. People don't donate to governments. They donate to nonprofit NGOs. So it's something that we're always trying to clarify to people.
This keeps the intentions very pure.
Yeah.
And not only for your operations, but also for the public perception of how people perceive your operations.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, they're not taking money. They don't have some big VC capitalist behind them. They're doing this for the mission. And I think at this point, you've beyond demonstrated that you're for real with this mission. I imagine in the beginning, it was a bit trickier.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. We want to jump back into this, this controversy around the strategic Bitcoin reserve. But let's talk about El Salvador for a little bit. In fact, it might relate because in 20 minutes, Bukele has a call with Trump. Did you see that?
True. Yeah.
Kind of, maybe we can, I don't know if we want to really pull it up or something, but that would be interesting if there's a big announcement during this conversation. I don't know if it's going to be live, but it's been announced. Check it out. Is it going to be live? Bukele and Trump doing a live Zoom call?
Would be crazy.
Anyway, okay. So what do you think of the IMF's relationship with Bukele here? Speaking of, donations, and obviously the IMF giving money to a country is a very different situation than a government giving money to an NGO. But that said, before we dive into that and its potential implications on Bitcoin here and what it means for Chivo wallet and people sending money from abroad, et cetera, I'm curious if what was the relationship like before? Has there been an IMF loan since Bukele got into office, or what has that relationship been like?
I don't know is the honest answer, but I don't think there has been an IMF loan since Bukele got into office. But there were IMF. El Salvador has had IMF loans before. I don't know when the last one. Yeah, I don't know when the last one was, but I definitely not since the Bitcoin law, and that was only 2 years after Bukele took office. So
I think there's I could Google it real quick. But yeah, go ahead. So let's talk about the implications of this. Okay,
this would be the first.
And so a lot of people are saying that it's okay. They're justifying it like it's not a bad thing. There still needs to be infrastructure built. Why sell your Bitcoin, et cetera, et cetera. And then people are like, they're just going to buy more Bitcoin with it. So what are your thoughts on this?
They are not going to buy more Bitcoin.
Oh, they won't be allowed to.
They won't be allowed to. And I think there's a misunderstanding among many Bitcoiners about how the IMF works.
Mm-hmm.
There
it is. Okay.
Oh, well, that was
so
cool.
These are all the history of the loans. 2020 rapid financing instrument amount.
Probably some like COVID stuff or something. Yeah.
But only 300K. Is that millions or is that probably millions? 300 million and thousands of SDRs. I don't know what SDRs means. But anyway, if you're listening and not seeing this on the screen, there's a big chart here. It's actually, so 2020, then the last one was 2010.
Yeah.
Then 2009, 98, 97, 95. So a bunch in the 90s, Only 2 in the 80s, 2 in the 70s, a bunch in the 60s.
So the rapid finance and instrument. So the last one, it's categorized differently. It's the only one that is not standby arrangement, and it's April 2020. My guess would be that's COVID related.
That's a Bukele one.
That's a Bukele one, but
Yeah.
but like a COVID related,
Different style of loan.
yeah, not the typical
Right.
one that they give. What they're talking about now would be the more typical one.
Right. Okay, so you mentioned you think a lot of Bitcoiners have incorrect understanding of the IMF. They haven't read John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Remember that book?
Yeah.
That changed my perception of the world.
Yeah, for sure. And I think people consider the IMF and the nation, so the lender and the lendee, to be on equal footing. That is not true. It is heavily tilted in the favor of the IMF. It is heavily tilted toward the lender, right? So the IMF is not agreeing to the conditions that El Salvador sets. El Salvador is agreeing to the conditions that the IMF sets. And the reason why they can't buy Bitcoin with money from this loan, I'll talk about it for two reasons, direct and also indirect. So they can't directly do it because one of the conditions of the draft agreement was that they would have to, I forget the exact wording, but they would have to tamper their public, their public spending or their public acceptance of Bitcoin, but that they would have to tamper it, right?
You can't pay taxes.
Sphere.
You can't pay taxes with Bitcoin anymore. Yeah.
So this would, for them to buy more Bitcoin with it, rather, like for them to be steady, I think is probably okay. But for them to increase the amount of Bitcoin that they're buying would definitely not be considered tampering their public exposure. I think that's what it was, public exposure. Yeah. So what a lot of people say is money is fungible. You know, they spend the exact dollar bill with that serial number they're going to spend on infrastructure, but money that they would have spent on infrastructure is now freed up and they could buy Bitcoin. I get it. Money is fungible. The important thing here is if it's some sort of like gray area where it could be open to interpretation, it is not the interpretation of El Salvador. It's the interpretation of the IMF, whether they are abiding to the spirit of the agreement. El Salvador, once they make that agreement, they don't get to decide whether they're following it or not. The IMF does. And the loan will be dispersed exactly because of this, because they don't want countries to use it for things that the IMF dictates where that money goes. And one of the mechanisms that they use to do that is they don't give you the money all at once. So in this case, it would be dispersed in 40 separate payments over a 40-month period.
And the minute you're not following the conditions anymore, it stops.
Not only the minute you're not following the conditions, it stops, but you would be blacklisted, right? You would never get this loan again. You would never get a loan from the Inter-American Development Bank, which is fine. Maybe they don't want to.
Do you have to pay the other money back right away or something?
Well, so, and this is something else that I think is misunderstood about that. So I worked in the UN system for 10 years, and I was an anti-IMF activist, like way before.
Professionally.
Yeah, like way before I discovered Bitcoin, I was pushing back against the IMF. Like most of my life, I've been studying the evils of the IMF, basically. And one of the misconceptions that people have is a lot of people seem to think that the IMF has leverage over El Salvador while they're negotiating the terms, but once it's signed, then they have less leverage. It's actually the opposite. The IMF has like almost no leverage over El Salvador at this point. Once El Salvador owes them money, then the IMF has a lot more leverage over them.
Don't they already owe the IMF other money though?
They do, but the more they owe them, the more leverage they have.
Because I remember seeing a Max tweet a few months ago saying some big debt payment that Bukele made, almost $1 billion or something, and like how by 2030 you're going to be debt free.
They've actually bought back a lot of their debt at a discount, right? Because of this fear mongering of the IMF and like, you know, the status quo of the world, like, you know, El Salvador adopted Bitcoin, so that was a bad idea. It didn't give a lot of confidence to traditional debt buyers, right? So El Salvador was able to buy back their debt at a pretty steep discount. Not all of it. There still is some outstanding debt, but they bought back a lot of it for like, you know, 50 cents on the dollar, which is like wonderful for them. It's another, you know, honestly, I think there are things happening that I don't understand because
Sure.
all of the information that I have says that this is a bad idea.
How many billions of dollars is this loan supposed to be?
So with the IMF,
1.9 or something?
I would have done some research.
I think it was 1.9. We have computers.
So I think it was like 1.4 direct from the IMF, but typically when the
1.4.
IMF gives a loan, then that basically gives a green light for some other agencies like the Inter-American Development Bank to give loans in similar amounts. So I think the total would be 4 point something billion, but direct from the IMF would be 1 point.
So let's just say it's 4 billion.
Yeah.
I'm gonna add all these zeros in my calculator here. 40 payments, right?
Yep.
I don't know what that means. 1E8. How many zeros is that? So look, let's just pretend it's 4 million divided by 40. That's 100,000 a month, and so that's 3 more. That's like 100 million, 40 times, or 10 million 40 times.
Yeah.
Something like that. Okay. So whatever they're using 10 million for or 100 million for every 40th increment, what would that be used for? Infrastructure. I heard some people speculate that maybe paying all the electricity bills this month, like initiatives like that. But I guess I'm bringing that up to be like, okay, what if he paid off all the other outstanding debt with Bitcoin games, for example, and then took this new loan, which I don't know the interest rates or anything like that, but everyone's imagining Bitcoin to appreciate super fast here, at least this decade, if not this year, depends on Trump, whatever. Imagining that, hey, we're just going to sell off that Bitcoin and pay off that loan. It's like for pennies. It's like, who was that guy during the Weimar Republic, bought up all the Deutschmarks, got into debt and then it hyperinflated and it was easy to get out of the debt. So it could be a play like that. I hear what you're saying. Like your gut tells you it's just not a good idea.
So here's to summarize, like in a sentence, why I am opposed to El Salvador or any country for that matter, making a deal with the IMF. If you lay down with dogs, you get fleas.
Beautiful analogy. Yeah.
Like the IMF is not part of the solution. They are part of the problem. And it is, I think, a fool's errand, both at the government level and the individual level, to think that you could. The problem with trying to change something from within is it's not you who changes the system, it's the system who changes you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like and this is, an opinion, and other people will have the contrary opinion, but I think change comes from the outside, not from within. I think El Salvador's best chance at being part of a better future world isn't to try to reform broken institutions by participating with them. It's to build new ones. It's to build alternatives to it. And that's not what this is. This is doubling down on what I think has already proven to not work for most of the world.
Yeah, and so I think what you're trying to say, in essence, is a lot of Bitcoiners are looking for hopium, looking for some way to justify, like, oh, he's playing 4D chess or something like that. When
he's not, the IMF is. Like, and this is another misunderstanding. People, I think a lot of Bitcoiners were like, oh, look at what the terms would have been like 2 or 3 years ago, and look at the terms now. So he's been playing chess because the terms are much better, right? He's been playing hardball, and now the terms are acceptable where they weren't acceptable before. And that is literally the playbook of every country in the world when they negotiate with the IMF, is they try to play hardball and hold out to get better terms. That is not playing chess. That is just standard operating procedure for every country in the world, and the IMF knows it. The IMF is the one that's playing chess here, not El Salvador.
Okay. So two last points I want to make before we leave this topic. Number one is, I suppose if there's any space left to justify something like this, we would have to know what the money is going towards, why that liquidity would be necessary. Because obviously they're not going to sell the Bitcoin, $40 million. How many times would it be? 12 times, and they have their Bitcoin stack again, right? It doubles it. So it's really not that much value in terms of USD versus their Bitcoin stack. So the question is, where's the liquidity going towards? We don't know. And potentially, once we saw it, would we change our minds? That's the first point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's a question. It's
just like generally, it's almost definitely going to go to infrastructure, building better roads, more bridges. That stuff's expensive, and the IMF likes those things. So the IMF is not a neutral party. So the IMF is controlled by who funds it. And it's a lot of nation states fund it, but the primary funder is the US.
The US empire, baby.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's basically, it is soft power of the US empire. So the IMF is interested. The IMF is not in the business of making money. They forgive a lot of loans with conditions. It's almost like another negotiation. Like, okay, you don't have to pay it back. Instead, you have to do this, right? They're going to get something.
Let us build our oil refinery.
Yeah. So they're interested in two things, generally speaking. They're interested in increasing a nation's GDP. So it's just like, kind of growth is always good sort of mentality. And the other is they're interested in serving the interests of their financial backers, which is primarily the US.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, the second point I want to make about it is there's also an idea going around that Bukele is doing his best to make kind of like an international cushion in the case of some kind of violent world war. Meaning China has made the library. I guess China's making an Olympic-sized stadium over there too in Escalon, which is a lot of money as well. And then what was it? Turkey had a company that invested $1 billion, $4 billion, whatever it was, in a port down on the eastern side. And so the IMF is kind of like another team to take money from. And so this could create kind of like a bureaucratic cushion.
Right. And that actually does make sense to me and would be close to playing chess, right? That's like the multipolar world theory, and you don't need any party to hate you to the various poles around the world, right? Like China being one, the US being another, Turkey, or maybe they should get something from Russia, but like to have a good working relationship with the different poles if the world is going to collapse. That actually does make sense to me.
Yeah, or if you have a stockpile of Bitcoin or gold, if there's really gold in them hills around here and they start mining it, then a lot of other countries suddenly have incentive to invade El Salvador, which didn't exist before. Yeah. So if there's disincentivization by taking money from the multipolar order, perhaps it's a good move.
Yeah, that I think that is the only argument that I've heard for accepting the IMF loan that makes sense to me, is it's a signal to the US. And when I say the US, I kind of mean the West, right? Mm-hmm. It's a signal like, hey, we don't want to be your enemy. Like maybe we're going to do things a little bit differently, but we're not enemies. Let's have a cordial
Just
relationship.
give us a loan. It's cool. We'll pay your interest. We'll be
like
friends.
that actually makes sense. That's the only argument that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And the final point, I have one more point. I know I keep going on, is it's not signed yet. It's not real yet. So it might not even go through.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, Bukele, I think, was purposefully very quiet because it was a staff level agreement with the IMF. And then the next step is with him. But I don't think he's actually said anything about it. I mean, maybe for good reason either way. But
yeah. And that could, maybe they don't end up signing it because it's just a draft agreement. And I want to point out that most of the conditions of the draft agreement, I think, are net positive, right? Like Chivo is not a good Bitcoin wallet.
no, but that's
Right.
wait. There's only one thing about Chivo that I think was a good thing.
The ATMs.
Well, yes, but I mean 0% fees subsidized by the government, so they get all the UTXO data, whatever. But remittances.
Yeah.
So that was what I didn't even realize until I posted some posts about that, about all this, and someone's like, "We send Bitcoin to our family, and they use a Chivo ATM, and it's like, how much does Western Union charge? Like 14% or something crazy. Chivo 0.
Yeah. No, I actually like and use the Chivo ATMs, but like the Chivo wallet, both the POS and the
it's trash.
Retail wallet
It's
is
garbage.
terrible.
Yeah.
So for them to get rid of that is
they have to privatize it, they have to sell it, which means it'll get better because what do they say? Like,
well, it has a big market share, so
right, exactly,
attractive if you wanted. Basically, you'd have a head start if you bought that.
Like, what did they say? Like, the government is the only business that can be super negative and like do horrible service and stay in business.
Yeah.
And so I think Chivo is a good example. If that were to be privatized, obviously it wouldn't be 0% fees anymore.
Right.
But it could actually be they maybe finally will integrate Lightning, and that could be a net positive because there is a user base.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that specific conditions of the agreement are bad. I'm just saying that, if you lay down with dogs, you get fleas.
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, so that's a good segue into the U.S. Strategic Reserve. We can revisit this. Lay down with dogs, you get fleas. All right. We talked a bit about this yesterday, and it would be cool to continue where we were at earlier and kind of bring this up too. So we see potentially, like Cynthia Lummis, I saw her profile. It's Lummis, like hummus. It's not Loomis. I always said Loomis. Hummus, like Lummis, like hummus. And she's the new crypto asset director or whatever. And she really wants to strategic Bitcoin reserve, like you said, to strengthen the US dollar, which everyone's like, yeah, woohoo. Wait a minute. Like, is that what we're here for? So Eric V. Stacks had a really good point that he brought up in here a while back. And he's like, look, at the end of the day, am I going to vote for Trump or Kamala? Like, all that's kind of a joke. It's, the whole show, the whole clown show. But, and this is, me paraphrasing his idea. I'm not necessarily saying this is my idea, but Bitcoin on the balance sheet could be the only way to avoid some like economic apocalypse with the amount of debt the dollar's in, just the whole shit show that is the U.S. economy and the dollar being printed. There's nothing else. So to put it on the balance sheet, to print that money, to buy hard money, to buy sound money, it could theoretically be a way to avoid some serious economic fallout. But on the other side of the spectrum would be, I think Max Kaiser said it, if you're going to row 10 miles offshore, you got to row back or you sink.
Yeah.
So I think your opinion here is that this sinking ship needs to just play out, and we don't need to Band-Aid it up with a strategic Bitcoin reserve.
I don't think that we should be taking buckets to throw water off of a sinking ship, right? I don't think we should be trying to repair the hull. I think we should be building new boats.
Yeah.
And that's what this is. Boats. This is like, okay, the ship's sinking, so this is gonna keep it afloat. Like,
for how long will it keep it afloat, you think?
I don't know. I mean, potentially a while.
Yeah, huh?
Potentially a while. Potentially this is like gonna significantly extend the US empire. And it's not like a one, if this happens, um, it has such a big impact. It would be a series of actions, this just being one of them. But it's the same thing, if I'm being controversial, then I think USD stablecoins are part of the same package, right? The growth of USD stablecoins also perpetuate the dollar system, which perpetuates the US empire.
But you don't think things like Tether are just necessary in a globalized world where everyone uses the dollar as the unit of account? Like people want to swap into dollars so they can save. Like in Argentina, they're finally starting to come on to Bitcoin. But I remember like 5 years ago when we were stuck there for COVID, no one knew about Bitcoin. They wanted to save in dollars. I'm like, no, don't do that.
Right. I think there's a good argument for it as a bridge, but I think it's a really slippery slope from it being a bridge and like this is a temporary thing, to basically to connect Bitcoin and dollars via Tether. I think it's a slippery slope that what could start out as a bridge just becomes a reinforcing mechanism for dollars and ends up helping dollars more than Bitcoin on a longer timeline.
Okay, so what we're saying here is ideally we want to stop dealing with dollars, but all of these different things from strategic Bitcoin reserve to I think even the power of Tether, right? The company Tether all contribute to the dollar sticking around.
Yeah.
Even though in Tether's defense, like they provided a valuable service for a lot of people. I think it's a product people need and want, which is why it's so powerful.
Right. And there's a flip side. So on, in the case of Tether, and I don't really want to pick on Tether because they are the biggest one.
Yeah, but there's
USDC is the same.
Yeah,
like it's
right.
the same. The same thing applies to all of them. And some new one is going to shoot up.
Yeah, and they're all providing that service to people that want a stable coin valued in US.
But it's in, whether it's US Circle, is that the name of USDC, like the company that backs it? But whatever it is, the people that are issuing the stable coins, it's in their interest for that system to grow, right? This is good for them. And there's a demand for it. Like people want it, right? The same with the strategic Bitcoin reserve. If the US government started buying Bitcoin, it's good for the US government, right? Like, and people are going to pursue self-interest, and the US should do this. Tether should do this, right? Like it's in their interest to do this. It helps them. I'm just saying that that's not the world that I want to live in. I don't want to live in a world that transposes. I don't want to live in a future world that transposes the status quo of today into the future. I want to live in a future world that is different than the current order, right? And all of this are things that will extend the status quo rather than speed up its conversion, right? And it's always going to be painful to go between systems. But I don't think that's an argument to stay on this track. Like, well, it would be painful for us to switch from a dollar denominated global economy to a Bitcoin denominated global economy. It's still worth it, right? It's still something that we should be pursuing.
Do you think it's even going to be the real Bitcoin chain that they would adopt? So, for example, we mentioned this yesterday, and it's something worth thinking about. BlackRock owns enough Bitcoin now. Saylor owns enough Bitcoin now. Theoretically, the US could to suddenly say, hey, we're going to hard fork Bitcoin to be more compliant, and this is going to be the real Bitcoin now. And the reason that Trump's company is buying wrapped Bitcoin and Saylor is calling that Bitcoin, $47 million worth of Bitcoin, even though it's wrapped. And they're calling everything crypto. It's almost like they're muddying the waters. So people that they're finally like going to come into the space after a decade of thinking, it's a scam, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Even though it's more scammy than ever now.
Yeah.
But they come in, the waters are murky. They never learn what Bitcoin truly is. And then when BlackRock says, we're forking, this is going to be the official US Bitcoin. The other one's for Russia or whatever, criminals, then they have enough Bitcoin to tank the price as well of the original chain, which not to me, the Bitcoin will not die, certainly, but it could be a pretty serious event for most of the people that are holding Bitcoin as a store of wealth or want to see the number go up, or at least they don't want to see it go down so hard. What are your thoughts on that? You think that's a possibility?
I think the likelihood of that. So yes, it is a possibility, and the likelihood of that possibility goes up the bigger USD stablecoins grows, and the more Bitcoin is bought by the US government or the Chinese government, like large governments like that. I think the likelihood increases with that, and it decreases if stablecoins become less important in the future and the US government doesn't have Bitcoin. So I think it's always a possibility. I'd like that to be as unlikely as possible. But it's always a possibility.
Right. So how can the power of stablecoins go down? Just less demand for anything dollar denominated? People saying, I'm going to store in Bitcoin now, no more dollars, like that?
Yeah. Or, so the reason why people use Tether, they use it for two reasons. And again, I want to say USD stablecoins rather than like pick on a specific company. But the reason why they use that is because they want to avoid volatility, right? And because they have a short time preference. So the US dollar is always losing purchasing power, but it's losing it very slowly, but it is losing it.
Compared to other fiat currencies.
Yeah, compared to other fiat currencies like the Argentina or wherever the countries are where there's high demand for stable coins. It's not a demand for stable coins, it's demand for predicting the future better, right? It's a demand for stability.
So theoretically, a more stable Bitcoin price could also fulfill that role.
So more stable Bitcoin price will fulfill that. There could be mechanisms. So I don't like stable sats on Blink Wallet because there's counterparty risk. Do you know about stable sats?
I do not.
Okay, so stable sats on your Blink Wallet, you could peg the value of your wallet to US dollars, but it does that. So you have $10 worth of Bitcoin, and you could say, okay, I'm gonna roll the dice, and the price of Bitcoin goes up, so I have $11 now. The price of Bitcoin goes down, so I have $9 worth. You could put it in stable sats, which is a way for it to maintain its value
against the dollar.
Against the dollar.
Yeah.
So you always have $10 worth.
And you can spend that as Bitcoin, right?
Yeah, and you can spend it. So the way that they do that is through like a series of like calls and puts, like long and short contracts on Bitcoin to maintain that. And it's a great idea, and I think it's great that they're experimenting with that. I personally don't use it because there's counterparty risk, and I'd rather not have counterparty risk. But we could have stability without reinforcing the US dollar system, right? People aren't looking for dollars, they're looking for stability.
Mm-hmm. Predicting the future.
Yeah, and we could have that without reinforcing the dollar system. I don't know what the mechanism is. Like I don't know how to do that without counterparty risk. But the other change is we want to incentivize, I think collectively, like humanity, we want to incentivize people to have a longer view of the world in their life, like to change their time preference, to have I always get it confused, high time preference, low time preference,
low
time preference, for all the reasons that I said earlier, right? Like, I think a world with a lower time preference is a better world. And what people are seeking with this, it's high time preference to want dollars rather than Bitcoin. Because if you look at Bitcoin, if you believe, I mean, you have to have faith. You have to have faith in the dollar system too, that like it's not going to collapse, right? But people have more short-term faith in the dollar maintaining its purchasing power than they do in Bitcoin. But I think that if you zoom out, and if you're not looking at 5 days, but you're looking at 5 years, do you have more confidence in your dollars holding their purchasing power or your Bitcoin?
Ooh, well, if you're paying attention, you know the answer to that.
Yeah. So I don't think, and then maybe another, I'm just trying to like think of the counter arguments is, people in a lot of the world, they don't, Bitcoin is for savings and people need to be able to spend. Well, you could save $1, right? You don't need to save $1 million, right? You could start saving at a lower amount, and that
compounding returns.
Yeah.
You ever heard that? Like if you start with a penny and you compound it, you double it every day, you end up with like over $1 million in a month.
Yeah. So I agree with the argument of stable coins as a bridge for this moment in time. I worry that it becomes permanent.
Speaking of that, what are your thoughts on Tether moving to El Salvador? Although you told me before the show, I didn't realize this. Tether and Bitfinex have the same parent company, but Bitfinex was already here, right? Their headquarters? But they just had a strong presence here.
I mean, I don't think their headquarters are here.
Okay. Or I think Bitfinex Derivatives or something has headquarters here or something like that.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
They have like a license here.
Yeah, because of the securities laws, I guess,
Yeah.
digital. No, I'm just curious what you think. Is that a good look for El Salvador? I mean, like a company like Tether would want to be here. Does that speak to like the I guess regulatory freedom that Bukele is trying to put out there?
Well, I think the Salvadoran government definitely wants to attract, big companies here, and Tether is
it's a big one.
Bitfinex, they have a lot of money, right? Like they have employees and capital, and like they want to attract those people here. So I think from the El Salvador government perspective, it's a win, right? Like no doubt about it. Similar. I worry about the concentration of power. That's basically my thesis for everything. Is so let me give an analogy. I don't know where I even heard this first, but I think it's a great analogy about power. And that's what this is about. It's all about power. Power is like shit. If you spread it around,
it smells more.
No. if you spread it around, then it's a fertilizer.
Okay.
But if you just put it in one place, you concentrate it, you just have a big pile of it.
Attracts flies and it's gross.
It's just a big pile of shit.
Yeah.
Right. But if you spread it around, then it's fertilizer. And that's how I view power. So I'm suspicious of any concentration of power. And, Tether and Bitfinex, they are
powerful.
Yeah, they're big. They're big. So from the El Salvador perspective, they definitely want to attract companies like that here. So a win for them. But me and the government of El Salvador, we don't have to have the same opinion on everything.
That's the beauty of
yeah. But I'd rather the world be more decentralized than it is now. So I'm suspicious of anyone, whether it's a politician or an organization or a corporation, which is trying to consolidate power rather than distribute it. I think that that is the important question, and how I judge governments, politicians, organizations, corporations. Are you trying to consolidate power, or are you trying to distribute power? If you're trying to distribute power, I am all for it. If you're trying to consolidate power, then I think you're part of the problem. And the reality is, in the world that we live in, almost everybody's trying to consolidate power.
Right. Well, it's kind of a fiat thing,
Yeah.
fiat mentality, right? Scarcity. And all right, that's probably a good place to end it, but I do have one more question for you. Does My First Bitcoin have any ambitions to one day build its own wallet? And if it did, even if you don't, like a thought-provoking question, what would this wallet do differently than all the other wallets out there? And how would that play into the first principles of Bitcoin?
We definitely have no current plans to do that. Although, we have a new intro course, and I guess this would apply for the Bitcoin diploma as well. Something that we'd really like is to be able to use a neutral wallet, right? We're very particular about not playing favorites, because, again, one of the core theses of the project is we want to teach people how to think. We do not want to teach people what to think. And that seems like there's not a big difference between the two, but I think one perpetuates all of the problems that I see in the current world. Teaching people what to think and teaching people how to think, I think, is how we create this better world. So that informs everything that we do, which means that we don't have a standard wallet. Like, we always use this wallet. Like, this is the wallet that you have to download and, make your first transaction, because, we'll make transactions.
So having your own wallet is super counterproductive to that mission.
Yeah. So it's a struggle to try to figure out the best, because there's a lot of great wallets, but we don't want to insert our opinion too much in this. And we have our hands full with just like the current tasks, which is like, we're pretty focused, right? We have a very grand ambition, which is to entrench independent, impartial, community-led Bitcoin education around the world as a concept to defend and a concept to support. But because our geographic ambitions are so ambitious, I think it's important that we have a really narrow focus on what we do and how we do that, which is just introductory Bitcoin education.
How can people find your website?
So it's myfirstbitcoin.io.
.io. Cool. Well, check it out, everyone. It's really great work. You can see the GitHub from there, which has everything open source, the whole curriculum, the whole book. You can print it out on your own. I gave a copy to my mom. She was super grateful. And so if you're interested in what's going on in El Salvador, check out buildinelsalvador.com, because we're building an online community where we get great perspectives, like people from John, where they give you some insider information on what it's like to do things here. And we're about to have one of those insider conversations, but the camera's not going to be on for it. So check out buildinelsalvador.com to get access. You can also get a free blueprint to El Salvador to see what's going on here, learn the lay of the land, see if maybe it's for you, see if maybe there's a plan B in El Salvador for your future here. So thanks for joining us, John. And is there anything else you want to say?
No, maybe I say no and then I say something.
Maybe
okay, fine. Yes, you got me. I think one of the really valuable things that Bitcoin teaches us is that we don't need anybody's permission, right? So if you want a better future, it's up to you to build it and start today, right? Like, you can define your own destiny. No one else will do it for you.
That's pretty much going to be the slogan for the Sovereignpreneur.
Yeah.
You don't need anyone's permission.